I want to tell you about the day I broke a world open from the inside. Not metaphorically. Not as a figure of speech that a dean of sciences uses when he's trying to explain a funding request to a university board. I mean that I, Trevor Anderson, volcanologist, formerly of Boston, only of a lawn chair on a porch in coastal Maine, where the sunsets are quiet and nobody is trying to eat me. I ignited a magnesium seam inside a sealed subterranean biosphere using a road flare, triggered a geyser that had been dead for a decade, and shot myself and two other human beings through a volcanic throat at several hundred kilometers per hour, until we came out the other end into the Italian countryside and scared a farmer's goats half to death. That was how we left. Getting in was considerably less dramatic and considerably more stupid, and I will get to that. But I want you to understand something first. The geology, before the biology of that place, before the creatures we encountered, and the things that tried to kill us. You need to understand what I understood only after we came back. We were not the first humans to fall into that world. We were almost certainly the last, and the gap between almost and certainly is exactly as wide as the gap between a lit flare and a volcanic wall, that nobody else had been patient enough, or scared enough, or scientifically literate enough to read correctly. My brother Max read it. He read everything correctly. He just didn't make it out. That is the part that still costs me sleep. Max disappeared 10 years before this story begins. He was a volcanologist, same as me, though he was always better at the intuitive end of the work. The sense for what a mountain was doing on the inside before the instruments confirmed it. He had been pursuing a theory that a small community of researchers called the Deep Passage Hypothesis, that volcanic fissure networks ran not just through the mantle but through sealed chambers of atmosphere on water, intact biospheres trapped under geological pressure since the Cretaceous or earlier, places that had been closed off from the surface for 65 million years, places that had kept right on going, evolving, differentiating, filling every available niche, pressure testing every piece of biology against every other piece of biology in a sealed system with no exits and no imports and no disruption, while the surface world went through its extinction event and started over from scratch. The mainstream geological community called this lunacy. I was, for most of my adult life, part of the mainstream geological community. Max died, we assumed he died, on a research trip to Iceland. Fissure monitoring station on Snaefells went dark in February. His equipment was recovered. His vehicle was at the trailhead. He was not. The search and rescue effort lasted 9 days. The university waited 2 years before officially reclassifying him as deceased for administrative purposes, which is the institution's way of saying they needed the office space. 10 years later, my nephew Sean came to stay with me for a fortnight while his mother relocated to Canada. Sean was 15, he was Max's son. He had Max's eyes, that specific shade of gray-green that in bright light went almost to hazel, and Max's habit of picking up rocks wherever he went and turning them over in his hands, the way some children pick up stray cats. Automatically, without seeming to think about it, an involuntary claiming. He had grown up knowing his father only as an absence with a name and a box of kept photographs. And I had done a poor job over the years of filling that shape. The distance between Boston and wherever Sean was living had been convenient for both of us, in the way that convenient distances usually are. Comfortable enough that neither party has to address what the distance is standing in for. I was also, at the time of Sean's arrival, about to have my departmental funding cut, Max's lab, which I had been maintaining for 10 years in his name, keeping the seismic instruments at caliber, keeping the fissure readings logged, filing the data into an archive that no one in the department read anymore, was being shut down. The university had been patient. 10 years of patience had apparently reached the institutional limit, which I understood even as I sat across from the department head and heard the language of resource reallocation applied to a dead man's work. Sean's mother had left me a box of Max's personal effects when she dropped the boy off. I had possessed the box for several years without opening it. That night, with Sean asleep in the spare room and the apartment quiet, I opened it. Inside was a copy of Verne. Not unusual. Max had always kept a well-annotated copy on his desk, the way certain scientists keep a Bible they no longer believe in but cannot bring themselves to shelve. Not for faith, but for the architecture of the thought inside it. What was unusual was the marginalia. Max had been writing in the book's margins right up until the end, in a cramped technical shorthand that I recognized because we had developed it together as undergraduates, a private notation for rapid field recording. It took me 4 hours to decode enough of it to understand what I was looking at. He had found a fissure, not just a fissure, a passage. A volcanic throat that opens seasonally on Snaefell's in response to geothermal pressure fluctuations, that created a brief temperature and gas differential between the surface system and whatever lay below. He had triangulated its location from seismic readings that matched, in frequency and timing, identical readings being collected by an Icelandic volcanologist named Sigurbjorn Asgeirsson, who had been running the same data from the eastern approach to Snaefell's and arriving at the same conclusion by a different route. The two of them had been corresponding. They had planned to enter together. They had spent a year coordinating the approach. Max went alone. The marginalia didn't explain why. The last entry was a coordinate and 4 words. It is real. Going. I looked across the kitchen table at the spreading mess of decoded notes. Then I looked at Max's copy of Verne. Then I looked at the coordinate, which I recognized. I had driven past the trailhead it marked during the search, 10 years ago. We had searched the surface. We had looked in every direction that a missing man could reasonably be expected to go. We had not looked down. We had not looked down because looking down would have required taking Max's hypothesis seriously, and the search coordinator had been a geologist with institutional credentials and a firm belief in the limits of what the deep rock could contain. I was looking at the notes of a man who had gone down and found something. I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. Then I heard movement in the hallway, and Sean appeared in the doorway, wearing an oversized shirt and looking at the papers on the table with the specific alertness of someone who has been awake for a while and has been waiting for a reasonable moment to enter. "You've been reading that for 3 hours," he said. "You've been awake for 3 hours." "Yes." He came and sat across from me, and I told him what I'd found, all of it. He listened the way Max had always listened, without interrupting, with that quality of attention that is not passive but active. The kind of listening that is also, underneath, calculating. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Iceland," he said, "the fissure opens in pressure cycles. The next window, based on Max's readings, is in approximately 48 hours. Sean looked at the coordinate, then at me. "How do we get to Iceland in 48 hours?" Sigurbjorn Asgeirsson had been dead for 3 years. A stroke clean and final. At his desk in the farmhouse below the Snaefell's glacier, with his notebooks open beside him and the seismic instruments still running in the outbuilding because no one had thought to turn them off. His daughter Hannah ran the family's mountain guiding operation from that same farmhouse. A practical woman in her early 30s who had her father's ranginess and her father's reputation for reading the volcanic terrain of the western fjords better than anyone else operating commercially in the region. She met us at the door. I introduced myself and said Max's name, and she looked at me for a moment, with an expression that was not quite surprise, more like the specific recognition of a thing that has been expected long enough, that its arrival feels more like confirmations than news. She made coffee. She went to her father's study and came back with a box from under the desk, not from under the bed as I had imagined. The practicality of it was very much in keeping with what I was learning about her. She set the box on the table and lifted the lid, and the notebooks inside were arranged by year and labeled in a neat Icelandic hand. "He wrote to your brother for 7 years," she said. "After the correspondence stopped, he kept writing the letters anyway. He said the data was still coming in and someone should have it." She opened the last notebook. The final entries were technical. Seismic readings, pressure differentials, temperature gradients at the Snaefell's eastern approach. And then they stopped mid-page, as though the writing hand had simply paused between one measurement and the next, and not returned. Page after was blank. The notebook after that was new, purchased and not yet written in. We spent an hour going through the data together, Hannah reading her father's Icelandic shorthand and translating the technical sections where they matched Max's English notation. Picture that emerged was the same picture I had assembled from Max's margins, the same fissure, the same seasonal window, the same deep passage hypothesis confirmed from two independent approaches, and one additional element that Max had noted briefly and Bjorn had documented in detail. A temperature anomaly in the gas venting from the fissure approach, a chemical signature consistent with what you would expect from a large volume sealed atmosphere that had been cycling in isolation for geological time. Cave, not a void, an active system. Hannah looked at the clock. The pressure window opens in 4 hours. We'd three hours to reach the approach from here. Then we have 1 hour, I said. What do we need to bring? I was a volcanologist with depleted departmental funding and 48 hours of advance notice. We brought what we had. Headlamps, the thermal kit Hannah kept for high-altitude guide work, 2 coils of rope, her climbing gear, my rock hammer, a canvas bag of Max's instruments that I had been keeping in the lab, including, as it turned out, 2 road flares that Max had packed for the original trip and never used. Sean was already by the door with his pack on before I finished the inventory. We drove north through the pre-dawn dark, with the heater running and Hannah navigating from memory, and Sean watching the Icelandic landscape go past the window with a focused quiet that I had seen on Max's face at the beginning of fieldwork. The particular stillness of a purse who started calculating and not yet found the limit of the calculation. The fissure opened in a cave system on the western approach to Snaefells, and it opened the way a lock opens when you have had the key long enough. Not suddenly, but with the quality of something that had been waiting for the right combination. The geothermal reading I took at the mouth of the cave matched Max's marginalia to within half a degree. The passage breathed. A slow warm exhale of air from below that carried the chemical signature of deep rock oxidation, metallic and clean, nothing like the sulfur of surface venting. We were 30 meters inside the cave when the storm came in. It moved faster than the weather radar on Hannah's phone had suggested. The western fjords, in late spring, have their own relationship with prediction. And the lightning hit the cliff face above the entrance twice in under a minute. Seek and sag strike brought rock down. A lot of rock. We heard it coming and pressed back against the cave wall. And the collapse happened in the space of 4 seconds. And then there was silence and dust, and the entrance was gone. I stood with my back to 2 tons of collapsed stone and put my headlamp on the ceiling and took a breath and said, in what I hoped was a scientific tone of voice, down is the only option we have right now. Hannah was already examining her rope coils. Sean was crouched at the inner edge of the cave, running his hand along the floor where the rock changed character. The transition zone where the cave substrate shifted from the volcanic surface geology to the fissure passage below. There's air moving, Sean said. A lot of it from down here. That's the passage, I said. It feels warm. Yes, he looked up at me. Okay, we went down. The fissure narrowed into a shaft. The volcanic throat that Max and Bjorn had predicted. The same geological feature Verne had described a century and a half earlier in the margins of a novel that the scientific community had never taken seriously. The shaft angled gradually and then sharply, and the angle became a slide. A water-carved channel in the basalt, smooth alas, descending at roughly 45 degrees. We went down it in stages, breaking against the walls where we could, losing the break where we couldn't, and I was doing geothermal math in my head throughout. Pressure differential calculation, descent rate estimation, atmospheric model for whatever we were about to fall into, which is a coping mechanism specific to people who have run out of better options and need something technical to do with their hands, while gravity makes the decision for them. The slide opened without warning. We fell. The fall lasted long enough that I had time to think clearly about it, which is not a comfortable amount of time for a fall to last. Then cold water hit me from every direction at once and I went down and came up sputtering and got my headlamp out of my jacket pocket and switched it on. Sean was there, 2 meters to my left, blowing water out of his nose. Hannah surfaced immediately to my right, already orienting herself, already looking upward to check the shaft. The shaft was gone. The rock above us was smooth and old and wet and gave no indication that it had ever had an opening in it. Then the light changed. Not our lights, the water itself. Bioluminescence. a soft blue-green pulse rising from the deep below us, spreading outward from where we had broken the surface, as though our arrival had triggered a cascade through whatever organism was producing it. It spread for hundreds of meters in every direction before it faded, and in that spreading underwater glow, I saw what was around us for the first time. Cavern was not a cavern. It was a world. The ceiling arched 2 kilometers above us at minimum, lit by a substrate of glowing mineral deposits that ran through the basalt like a second sky, dimmer than daylight, warmer than moonlight, the color of a gas flame seen through green glass, and it stretched across every surface of the ceiling in a continuous lattice that meant no matter where you looked up, there was light. Not bright enough to read by at distance, but bright enough to see by. Bright enough to make out the shoreline 500 meters ahead of us. Low and black. Bright enough to see the far shore, which was so far away that I could only determine it existed by the way the bioluminescence reflected differently off the vertical surface in the distance. And bright enough to see the plesiosaurs. They were moving in formation. 6 of them, possibly 8, arranged in the way that large pelagic predators arrange themselves when they are not actively hunting, but are not fully passive either. The space between social behavior and patrol, long-necked, dark-backed, their bodies below the waterline, but their necks, extending upward with the slow, deliberate movement of animals that have been the largest things in their environment for so long that the concept of a threat no longer registers as a meaningful category. The nearest one turned its head toward us. A head the size of a compact car, on a neck that rose 4 meters above the waterline, and regarded us with an eye like a polished stone, wet and dark, and containing whatever passed for intelligence in an animal whose lineage had been running this water since before the surface world had complex vertebrates. I know what plesiosaurs were. I know the peer-reviewed literature on their feeding behavior, their social structure, their probable end-of-life ecology. I know the anatomical debates about lunge feeding versus ambush feeding that were still unresolved in the journals as of the previous autumn. I know all of this academically, with the confidence of a man who has spent his career in the physical sciences and is comfortable with the architecture of what is known and what is estimated. Looking at 8 of them from water level in the dark, with no shore within sprint distance, the distinction between lunge feeding and ambush feeding felt somewhat theoretical. Swim, Hannah said. She was already moving, low in the water, arms close to her body, minimal surface disturbance. Splash. Don't make large movements. We swam. We kept our breathing as quiet as we could. The plesiosaurs tracked us with the unhurried awareness of creatures that did not need to hurry, that had never needed to hurry, in a system where nothing moved faster than they did. The nearest one dipped its head below the surface for a moment and came back up with something in its jaws that was still moving when the jaws closed. Another turned toward us, neck extended, and I watched it in my peripheral vision without turning my head, counting strokes, measuring distance to shore, calculating. The largest, I estimated 20 meters from rostrum to tail, which would make it the largest plesiosaur in the fossil record by 6 meters. And the fossil record has no way of knowing what 6 million years of isolated evolution can produce in a sealed deep system with no competing pressures. Turned away from us entirely. It may have judged us not worth the energy expenditure. It may have been full. It may have been responding to something deeper in the water. I did not stop swimming long enough to determine which. We reached the far shore in just over an hour. The shore was not sand. It was a fine black volcanic substrate, silicate deposition from the vent system above, ground fine by the underground tidal action of the interior sea over millions of years of cycling. It was warm underfoot, even through boot leather. The mushrooms grew in the shallows where the substrate met the waterline, not the kind of mushroom you find in a temperate forest, not the scale of mushroom you find in any surface ecosystem. These were the product of 65 million years of uninterrupted growth in a sealed system with no herbivory above a certain size, which meant no evolutionary pressure toward small. They grew to the height of mature oaks. Their caps spread 15 meters across. They shed a continuous fine phosphorescent drizzle of spores that drifted in the still underground air like snow under streetlights. And the spores themselves were bioluminescent. The entire shoreline glowed with it, a dim, warm gold-white that added to the ceiling's blue-green and made the air look thick with light. I found Max's equipment cache in the first 10 minutes. It was tucked under the root structure of the largest mushroom, within reach of the shore. The same thing he'd have done in any field situation, using available cover for storage. A sealed tin marked with the research station's stencil code, Fiend inside, a thermometer with his initials scratched into the casing, a compass whose needles spun uselessly in the magnetic field of this place, a torpedo-proof case containing film rolls he would have had no way of developing, and a journal, half full, his handwriting unmistakable, growing slightly more compressed toward the end of the written pages in the way that handwriting compresses when the writer is aware of conserving space. I sat on the volcanic shore under a mushroom the size of a house and read my dead brother's words while Hannah scouted the tree line. And Sean stood at the water's edge, watching the distant dorsal fins of plesiosaur make slow arcs in the bioluminescent glow. Max had been alive down here for at least 6 weeks. He had mapped the immediate coastal geography, catalogued species in methodical order, noted temperature and atmospheric readings at regular intervals. His temperature readings were 2 degrees lower than mine, which told me the geothermal cycle was accelerating. The biological catalog was extraordinary. 47 species in 6 weeks, including not just the plesiosaurs and the trilobites in the shallows and the various cave-adapted arthropods in the mushroom root systems, but also in the entries from his 3rd week, the first mention of the Keth. He called them the Keth because they made a sound he transcribed as Keth, Keth, in rhythmic pulses when they were hunting. A pressure valve release from what he believed was a resonant structure in the throat, used for communication in a light-limited environment where vision was not always reliable. He described them as bipedal, heavily scaled, ranging from 2 to 3 meters in height, with 4-fingered hands, ending in retractable claws of a dark keratin composite, and eyes that caught the underground bioluminescence. The way a cat's eyes catch headlights, that sudden phosphorescent flare in the dark that tells you something is looking back before you can see the thing it belongs to. They were not dinosaurs. They were not any branch of the Cretaceous fauna he had been cataloging. They were something separate, something the surface world's extinction event had apparently not reached, or had reached and not finished, or had bypassed entirely through the accident of geological enclosure. They were the dominant species of the interior world. They had been running this system, without competition, without external pressure, without anything entering from outside, for geological time. His notes on their behavior were careful and specific. They patrolled in groups of 3 to 5. They communicated in the Keth rhythm, and in subaudible pressure pulses he could feel in his sternum. They were aware of his camp within 72 hours of his arrival, despite every precaution he had taken. Keth had a taxonomy for their world. Everything that lived in it, every species, every behavior pattern, every threat level. Max's impression from observation was that they categorized everything around them with the precision of a predator that has had geological time to learn the edges and characteristics of every other living thing in its environment. They had categories for prey. They had categories for danger. They had categories for things that were in the process of dying and things that were already dead. They did not. Max noted in a handwriting that had become very controlled by this point in the journal. Have a category for something that had entered their world from outside. Nothing had ever entered from outside. The world was sealed. The taxonomy had never needed that category. He wrote, in the margin of that entry, they keep coming to look, not hunting, studying. I think they are trying to decide what I am. The journal ended 14 days later. The final entry was 3 words, written with the steady hand of a man who was not panicking. They found me. I closed my brother's journal and sat with it for a moment. The mushroom spores drifted down around me, in their slow bioluminescent fall. The underground sea breathed against the dark shore. Somewhere behind the tree line, at the edge of audible range, I could hear the faint rhythm that Max had transcribed. Keth, 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 Keth. Moving at a deliberate pace, not rushing, the sound of something that has never needed to rush, the journal in my pack. And stood up and called Hannah and Sean back from the positions they had taken. I told them everything Max had written, all of it without softening any of it, because softening facts when people are in danger is how people in danger make bad decisions. Sean listened with his eyes on the tree line. Hannah listened, her eyes on me. The specific attention of a person who is simultaneously absorbing information and building a response to it. How do we get out? Sean said. Hannah was already ahead of us. Same mechanism Vern described. There's a volcanic vent on the far side of this interior. A geyser that operates during pressure cycles. If we can reach it during a cycle, the water column launches us upward. How far is the far side? My father's calculations put the interior diameter at approximately 40 kilometers. I looked at the tree line. Keth sound had stopped. We should move, I said. We moved. The interior of that world was the most dangerous 40 kilometers I have traveled. And I have done field work in places where the ground has active geological opinions about whether you continue existing. Every ecosystem has its hazards. Every predator ecology has its hierarchy. What that sealed world had, which nothing on the surface quite replicates, was the quality of an optimized enclosure. The sense that every danger we encountered had been running in this system long enough to become maximally efficient. The way a trap becomes maximally efficient when it has been catching the same thing for long enough. There was no softness to any of it. Nothing in that world had experienced the pressure of outside interference, outside import, outside disruption. Everything had been competing against everything else for 65 million years of isolation. And what that produces, at the biological level, is a degree of specialization that makes the surface world's predator ecology look like a rough draft. The carnivorous plants in the forest behind the mushroom shore were the first encounter after we moved inland. They were nothing you would recognize as a plant from a distance. The shape was wrong, too angular, too responsive. They could distinguish between motion caused by air movement and motion caused by biological mass. And the distinction appeared to be chemical as much as mechanical. They were reading the carbon dioxide plume of a warm-blooded organism moving through their zone. They moved toward that plume with a speed that was inconsistent with the apparent structure of their biology, which told me that the apparent structure was not the actual mechanism. We moved through them quickly, staying in Hannah's single-file line, and Sean caught a trailing tendril across the arm that left a welt the width of my thumb. He didn't slow down. The underground river we had to cross was perhaps 50 meters wide. Piranha were in it. I am using the surface analog name because the precise taxonomy of a species that has been evolving in isolation for 65 million years does not have a surface equivalent. They operated as a coordinated unit in a way that individual social predators do not. Not a school, but a net, reading the water for the pressure signature of something crossing and arranging their positions in response. Hannah crossed first with the rope, picking a line through the shallower rocks. We crossed in under 4 minutes. The net tightened as Sean cleared the far bank. We were on shore when it reached the crossing line. Close enough that I do not like thinking about the timing. The magnetic rock field past the far bank was the section of the interior that I have spent the most time writing about. In the field notes that I am not permitted to publish, the volcanic substrate in that region had been pushed into vertical floating columns by the interaction of deep rock electromagnetic fields, cycling through the interior geology. Each column roughly 1 to 3 meters across, flat-topped, arranged at irregular intervals of roughly 0.5 meter to 2 meters. Floating at a height of perhaps 6 meters above the underlying rock, the electromagnetic field pulsed on a cycle of approximately 45 seconds. When the pulse was at peak, the columns were stable. When it was at trough, the columns shifted, not randomly, but in a systematic drift that I worked out was consistent with a secondary resonance pattern in the underlying geology. The cycle was predictable. The timing required precision. We lost each other in the middle of it. Sean went first. He had been ahead of us by 10 meters when a pressure vent below the rock field triggered. A thermal vent from below, not related to the electromagnetic system. A geothermal exhale that hit him broadside, with enough force to knock him sideways off the column he was on. He caught the edge, got back up, but the recovery put him on the wrong column at the wrong phase of the cycle, and when the next trough came through, he went right and we went left. And then the pulse came in, between us, and the columns shifted, and there was 40 meters of magnetized floating rock between me and where I had last heard my nephew. I want to be honest about the next hour. I am a scientist. I handle high-stakes situations with what my colleagues have always described as an unsettling degree of calm, which is accurate but incomplete. Calm is not equanimity. Calm is what happens when the emotional processing routes around the thing that cannot be processed in real time and shunts everything into the technical track. I crossed the magnetic field with Hannah, working the pulse interval pattern and counting the seconds between the trough and the peak, picking columns by the secondary resonance logic. And I did it with the mechanical focus of a person solving a calculation, rather than a person whose brother had died in this world and whose 15-year-old nephew, Rebus, had just been separated from him by a geological feature that could kill him in 11 different ways. We found Sean on the far side. He had crossed alone. He had worked out the pulse interval by counting. He was sitting on solid rock on the far bank with his knees up and his face pale and a bleeding cut on his left hand from where a shifting column had caught him when he was making the last jump. But he was there, and he was whole, and he looked at me with his father's gray-green eyes and his father's specific quality of composure. I timed the pattern, he said. I know. I watched your last 6 columns. He looked at the cut on his hand. Then he put his hand in his pocket and stood up. Where next, he said. We kept moving. The bone plane was past the magnetic field, and the albino Giganotosaurus was on it. In Max's journal, it was called the White One, and his description was precise enough that when we saw it, we did not need to do any work to identify it. An apex predator. 2 stories tall, skilled pale as old snow, across every surface of its body. The result, I estimated, of a population that had been in a low-light environment long enough to deprioritize pigmentation generation after generation, until the gene expression was essentially absent. The eyes had followed the same logic. Pale pink, almost translucent, containing a tapetum lucidum adapted for the bioluminescent interior spectrum rather than surface solar light. The effect was that the eyes caught the underground glow and scattered it in a way that made them look lit from within. The creature was approximately 12 meters in length. It moved through the bone field with a deliberate slowness that was not caution. It was not moving slowly because it was being careful. It was moving slowly because it did not need to move faster. It was the largest thing on the flat ground. And it had always been the largest thing on the flat ground. And it had never encountered a reason to alter that assumption. The bone plane itself, a wide flat expanse of volcanic substrate, dark and smooth, carpeted in skeletal remains that had been accumulating here for reasons I could guess at but not confirm, bleached by whatever geothermal chemistry passed for weathering in that system. Large bones, mostly, recognizable by their architecture as the remains of animals significantly larger than humans. It was the specific kind of bone field that tells you something has been dying in one location for a very long time, which means something has been causing things to die in one location for a very long time. Sean went still beside me. The White One had its head down, moving parallel to us at perhaps 200 meters, working the field. Its nostrils were active. I could see the intake rhythm even at that distance. Then it stopped. The head came up. The pale eyes flared with the interior light. It had caught our scent. I want to tell you that I had a plan ready. I want to tell you that 40 years of geological fieldwork includes some directly applicable skill set for what happened next. What I had in reality was a rock hammer, 2 road flares in my jacket pocket, and the specific quality of stubbornness that runs in the Anderson family. The White One turned toward us and began to move. At 200 meters, it was not hurrying. It was not hurrying because it had never needed to hurry. The bone field was its record of what had happened to everything else in this world that it had decided to move toward. We ran. This is not a heroic passage. 3 human beings ran across a field of prehistoric bones with 2 tons of apex predator closing behind them. And running was the right decision, and we made it correctly. And it did not feel like anything, except very fast and very loud, and the specific sensation of air burning in your chest when you are asking more of your body than your body would prefer to give. Sean ran with the mechanical efficiency of youth. Hannah ran the line a mountain guide runs, reading the terrain ahead. choosing the path that spent the least energy. I ran the way a man in his mid-40s runs when sufficiently motivated, which is to say less gracefully than either of them. But I ran. The white one was faster. It was closing, and I could feel the ground shake with each footfall, each one a seismic event that registered in my boot soles before my ears caught the sound. 40 meters of separation became 30. 30 became 20. I felt the ground change. The bone field ended at a wide flat exposure of muscovite, a broad pale section of the substrate where the geology had produced the layered silicate mineral I have spent my career studying. Smooth and pale and slightly translucent. The kind of formation you get over underground pockets where the geological consolidation is incomplete, where the strata has been compressed by time but not fused. I know muscovite. I know its tensile limits. I know how it fails under load, the pattern the fracture lines take, the way it propagates from point of stress outward through the weakest connecting grain boundaries. I know specifically and precisely what happens when you put 2 tons of moving biological mass on a muscovite formation over a void. I stopped running. Hannah looked back. I waved her and Sean off to the left, onto the dark basalt beyond the muscovite exposure, where the rock was competent and old, and would hold whatever came. Then I put myself on the muscovite, and I turned around and faced the white one at 15 meters, and I stood there. The creature was close enough that I could see the individual scale, texture on its snout. I could see the pale pink iris tracking me. I could see the nostrils working. It had never encountered something that stopped running toward it. Its taxonomy of prey behavior did not, I was reasoning, include this particular category of response. It slowed slightly, not from hesitation, I don't think, but from the mechanical adjustment of recalculating approach angle and speed. It hit the muscovite 3 steps later. The first step cracked it. The second step fractured it in 3 directions from the first crack, the lines radiating outward in the classic muscovite failure pattern, fast and clean. The third step found nothing solid, and the creature's front end went down. Fracture propagated the way brittle substrate always propagates when the keystone load point fails. Total and fast. The entire section reading the stress and giving at once, the crack lines meeting across the formation in under a second. The void below was deep enough that by the time the sound of the collapse reached the surface, the dust was already rising from it. I stood at the edge of the hole and listened to the echo die. Then I walked back to Hannah and Sean on solid rock. My hands were shaking. I put them in my pockets. Sean looked at the hole, then at me. "You just stood there," he said. "I know the rock," I said. It sounded simple. I let it be simple. Hannah found the boat. Or, rather, she found what could be made into a boat. The upper jaw of a large predatory animal that had died near the underground river between the bone plain and the geyser vent, close enough to the bank that the bones had been left when the biological mass went, and the jaw was curved and deep enough and long enough to function as a hull. It held 3 people. It was not comfortable. It was faster than swimming through water. We now had additional reasons not to be in. We sailed toward the geyser vent on the far side of the interior sea, and I read Max's journal for the second time, closely, paying particular attention to the entries from his 5th and 6th weeks. The ones he had written about the vent, the ones he had written knowing, I thought, that the vent was the only way out, and that he had made his calculations correctly, and that one specific thing was missing. Crooks. Max had studied the geyser during an active cycle. He had noted the water column, the pressure sequence, the temperature gradient through the vent floor, the chemical composition of the steam. He had run the calculation on what would be required to restart the geyser from a dormant state. Specifically, from the dormant state he could already see it moving toward the slow progression of a sealed vent system losing its pressure differential. And he had written, in the controlled handwriting of someone who knew exactly what he was describing and exactly what it meant. The east wall of the crater contains a continuous magnesium seam running at approximately 1 meter below the surface, visible from the interior through a narrow crack formation at the base of the wall. Behind the seam, water is moving under pressure. The same aquifer that originally fed the geyser, backed up now that the vent has closed. If the magnesium seam can be ignited, the heat will convert the water on contact to steam. Steam behind a sealed pressure wall with the geyser as the only available vertical outlet, will produce a column sufficient to exit the interior. One flare would be sufficient to initiate the seam burn. Estimated column height, well above the fissure threshold. He had written that calculation in his 5th week. He had been down here 6 weeks. He had not had a flare. I thought about that for a long time, sailing across the underground sea in a dead animal's jaw, with the bioluminescent water, black and glowing around us, and the ceiling's mineral light 2 kilometers above. Max had done everything right. He had found the fissure, entered it, survived the descent, catalogued the biology, mapped the interior, located the exit mechanism, and calculated precisely what was needed to activate it. He had sat at the geyser vent and done the same math I was doing and arrived at the same answer, and not had the thing he needed. I had 2 flares. I had packed them from his own supply, the ones he had left behind in the lab when he went to Iceland, because he hadn't planned to need them on a volcanological survey of a well-mapped surface fissure system. "Quiet," Sean said from the bow of the jawboat. "I'm thinking about your father." Sean was quiet for a moment. Then, was he right? About all of it? Everything he wrote is consistent with what we've seen. Every calculation checks out. Every biological observation is supported by what we've catalogued in the last 20 hours. I looked at the ceiling, the bioluminescent lattice, the scale of the place. He was right about all of it. Sean looked at the water. He just didn't have a flare. "No, but we do." "Yes." The geyser vent was a bowl of dark basalt at the center of a low hill, surrounded by the mineral deposition of a system that had been active for geological time, and then gone still. A ring of pale crystalline silicate, delicate as old lace, marking the old waterline in calcium and magnesium carbonate deposited by the water column over thousands of cycles. The crater itself was dry. The rock at its base was hot. I could feel the heat through my boot soles when I crossed to the center. A warmth that told me the geothermal source was intact, that only the water supply had failed. The vent was not dead, it was blocked. Sean ran his hand along the crater wall. He did it the way Max had done it. Not systematically, not analytically, but with the instinctive reading of rock that some people have and most don't. The sense that comes from growing up around geological obsession. He was at the east wall when he stopped and pressed his palm flat against the surface, and then crouched and looked at a narrow crack in the base of the wall. "Something's moving," he said. "In there I can feel it." I crouched beside him. Crack was a finger's width at most, running horizontal along the wall at floor level for perhaps 2 meters before it closed. Through it came a faint warm exhale, the chemical signature of oxidized magnesium, metallic and clean, and underneath it, pressurized water. Not the gentle seep of groundwater, but the specific smell of water under geological load. Water that has been pushed by thermal processes through sealed rock for long enough that it has run out of any other direction to go. Max had described this crack exactly. I stood up and looked at the wall, really looked at it. The way I look at rock in the field, reading the grain orientation, the fracture potential, the layer structure. The magnesium seam was there. A thin band of lighter material running through the basalt, rough cedar below the surface. Its trace visible in the crack opening as a pale streak against the darker surrounding matrix. Continuous. Unbroken for the length of the wall as far as I could see in either direction. Hannah had been reading the geology over my shoulder. "The water behind the wall," she said. "Yes. If you ignite the seam, the burn front reaches the water in how long? Seconds. The seam is continuous and the magnesium will burn fast in this oxygen concentration." I had checked the atmospheric readings during our crossing. The interior ran slightly higher than surface oxygen partial pressure, which was consistent with a sealed system, with active photosynthetic biology and no combustion. Everything in this world was very flammable. Nobody had ever brought fire into it. Hannah understood the second part without my spelling it out. She had been working through the calculation. "The steam column," she said. "The force of it." "Yes. We don't know the rock thickness between the seam and the water reservoir." "No. An estimate from the surface geology, probably 30 to 60 centimeters. If it's at the lower end, the burn through is faster, and the initial steam pulse is larger. If it's at the upper end, the burn through takes longer, and the initial pulse is smaller but sustained longer. Either case should produce sufficient column height." Should. I looked at her. What I can tell you with certainty is that staying produces a certain outcome. The interior temperature has risen 4 degrees since we arrived. The magma is rising. In 12 to 18 hours, this crater is vent gas. There is no other exit. Hannah looked at the crater. The dry basalt, the heat shimmering off the floor. She looked at the east wall. She looked at Sean, who was standing at the edge of the wall with his hand still on the crack. Not looking at either of us. Looking at the rock. Light the flare, she said. We put 30 meters between ourselves and the east wall. That was all the crater allowed. The rim on the west side gave us the hard stop. We pressed our backs against it, and I took the first flare from my jacket pocket and looked at it for a moment. I looked at Max's journal in my other hand. I thought about the last entry, 3 words, written calmly. I thought about the instrument cache under the mushroom root, the compass whose needles spun useless in this world's magnetic field. I thought about the equipment we had recovered from the search. His vehicle at the trailhead, his instruments logged and returned. Everything except him. 10 years of a shape in the world, and now the shape had a story in it. And the story ended at a vent with a dry crater and a sealed wall and no flare. I looked at Sean. He was looking at the wall. 15 years old, his father's eyes, his father's hands. He had crossed the magnetic field alone, and timed the pulse and made it across, and sat on the far bank with a bleeding hand, waiting for me to finish catching up. Struck the flare. It caught on the first stroke. The road flare has always struck me as an underappreciated piece of engineering. Straightforward, reliable, the product of a century of incremental improvement, toward a thing that works every time. I held it to the crack in the east wall. The magnesium caught in roughly 8 seconds. The initial burn was a blue-white streak, not a flame so much as a line of light, that traveled the seam laterally in both directions simultaneously. Fast enough that I had time to pull my hand back and turn away before it had traveled more than a meter. The sound that followed is difficult to describe to someone who has not heard geological pressure release in a confined space. It was not an explosion. The chemistry was wrong for that word. It was a conversion event. Solid rock, liquid water, and heat combining in the space of 3 seconds to produce steam behind a sealed wall with one available outlet. The burn front traveled the seam. It hit the water reservoir. The water became steam instantaneously at that contact surface, and the steam had nowhere to go except up. And the column that formed was every molecule of pressurized water behind that wall, converting at once into gas at a temperature and velocity determined by 65 million years of geological pressure looking for its exit. The geyser floor lifted. I had time to grab Sean's arm, and Hannah grabbed my jacket. And then we were moving, and the world was noise and speed, and the dark walls of the shaft blurring past in the light of the steam column, which was hot but not scalding. The water had traveled far enough through rock to lose the worst of its temperature, and the column itself was expanding as it rose, dissipating heat into the shaft walls. The narrow section at 800 meters. I felt it as a compression, a brief intense squeeze, and then the pressure differential on the far side of the narrowing was less than behind us, and we punched through it, and the shaft widened. Velocity was still there, and the steam column behind us was still pushing, and the rock walls were still going past in a blur, and then there was sky, blue. The specific blue of a late afternoon sky over southern Italy, a blue that hits you with particular force when you've been in the underground for 22 hours looking at bioluminescence and basalt. The steam column dropped away. The velocity dropped away. The trajectory arced and we were falling, and below us was hillside and green farmland, and a road in the middle distance with a vehicle moving along it. And goats. A field of goats, scattering in every direction, from the volcanic vent in the hillside that had just delivered 3 human beings to the Italian countryside. Without adequate warning, we hit the grass and rolled. I came to rest on my back and lay there. The sky was very large. I had not looked at a real sky in 22 hours, and the realness of it was almost physical. The depth of it, the actual blue, the actual light of the actual sun going down in the actual west. Feared a bird went across it. An ordinary bird, a swift, looping through the warm evening air above a Neapolitan hillside, completely indifferent. Sean sat up. He was bleeding from the hand again, the magnetic field cut, reopened by something in the ascent. He looked at it, then looked at the vent behind us, which was leaking a thin column of steam into the Italian air. Then he looked at me. "Is that it?" he said. I looked at the sky for another moment. "Your father read that wall correctly," I said. "He ran the right calculation. He understood everything that needed to be understood. He just didn't have a flare when he reached the vent." Sean was quiet. "He was right though," he said. "About all of it." "He was right about everything," I said. "He always was." We lay in the Italian grass, while the sun finished going down. And I held my brother's journal against my chest, and the goats gradually came back to the field around us. And somewhere below the hill, in the sealed world that had been running for 65 million years without interruption, the Keth were moving through their bioluminescent dark, and their taxonomy had a new category to find a name for. The aftermath is the part people ask about when they want a tidy ending. The university report, the biology department's review, the committee that spent 6 months determining that the geothermal readings were consistent with known Snæfell's anomalies and required no revision to existing geological models. The paper Hannah submitted, the one based on her father's data and her own field observation, rejected 4 times in succession before a journal in Helsinki published it on a page between 2 papers about sediment cores, with a note from the editor indicating that publication did not constitute endorsement of the hypothesis. None of that is the part that matters to me anymore. What matters is that Max was right. That sealed biospheres exist at depths surface science has not been willing to seriously look at. That inside one of them, the dominant intelligent species has been running a closed system for so long that the concept of outside interference does not exist in their taxonomy. Because nothing has ever come from outside. Nothing has ever entered their world without being catalogued and classified and assigned a role in the hierarchy that the Keth have spent 65 million years building. Nothing has ever entered their world and not eventually become part of what the bone plane records. 3 human beings. 1 middle-aged volcanologist with a working knowledge of rock stress mechanics and a dead brother's journal. 1 15-year-old boy who had taught himself to time electromagnetic pulses by counting seconds. A Icelandic mountain guide who had spent her adult life reading volcanic terrain that does not forgive errors, fell into that world, walked 40 kilometers of it, and burned their way out using a road flare and a calculation that a dead man had made 10 years earlier and left waiting for someone to complete it. Keth were watching when we left. I cannot prove this from direct evidence. I did not see them at the vent, and in the urgency of the ascent I was not conducting observation. But I know from Max's journal that they had been tracking us since shortly after the bone plane. And I know from the quality of the quiet in the last 2 hours before we reached the geyser that the Keth sound had stopped entirely. A predator that has decided to watch does not announce itself. See, they were the dominant intelligence in that world, and they had catalogued us, and they were watching us reach the vent. I think about what they saw. Small animals, smaller than most of the prey species in their catalog, with no particularly remarkable biological advantages, no useful physical traits beyond an upright gait and manual dexterity. Arriving at a dry vent that nothing had ever exited alive, standing in front of a wall that the interior geology had sealed, and producing fire. Fire, in a world that had never seen it. In an oxygen-rich sealed atmosphere that had been waiting 65 million years for a spark. I think about what it looked like from the rim of that crater when the east wall went. I think about what it looked like when the geyser column shot upward and 3 organisms that the Keth had been in the process of classifying as prey simply ceased to be in their world. I think they had to build a new category. Something that came from outside and then left again. Something their world had never produced a name for, because, until that afternoon on a hillside above Naples, it had never needed one. I sit on the porch in Maine when the sun goes down, and I look at the horizon where the ocean goes dark, and I think about the world below the world. Still running, still sealed, still cycling through its bioluminescent seasons with no disruption from above. The Keth still moving through it. The plesiosaurs still working the interior sea, the mushroom spores still drifting in the underground air like phosphorescent snow. And I think about Max, sitting at that dry vent with his calculations complete, and his journal nearly full, and one specific item missing from his kit. Reading the wall critically, knowing exactly what needed to be done, he did everything right. 2. He always did everything right. He got the hypothesis right, the approach right, the descent right, the survival right, the exit mechanism right, the calculation right. He was right about all of it. He just needed the flair. I finished it for him. That's the part I can live with. That's the part I go back to on the hard nights. When the main dark comes in off the water, and the porch light brings the moths. Max was right, and his son has his eyes and his hands and his way with rock. And the three of us came back out of a world that had never given anything back. We gave it something to think about. That seems right. That seems like enough.